I'm doubtful that any good Kathryn is doing could possibly outweigh the misery she's causing.
How can she claim to believe in the gifts of the Holy Spirit and yet never talk about her baptism in the Holy Spirit?
Isn't it ironic? The woman who preaches healing can't even heal herself. How can she claim to be a vessel of healing when she can't cure her own heart condition?
The man left his wife and children for her. How could she marry Burroughs Waltrip? It wasn't just a mistake, it was sin, rebellion against God. After everything she preached about purity and holiness.
In a shocking turn of events, Kathryn Kuhlman, the world-renowned evangelist and faith healer, is facing a major lawsuit filed by her former trusted associate, Paul Bartholomew. The staggering $430,500 in damages sought by Bartholomew has left the religious community stunned. People are questioning how such a highly regarded figure in the Christian world could find herself embroiled in such a bitter dispute with one of her closest confidants.
Kathryn Kuhlman was far from ordinary, and her story is anything but typical. On one hand, this is one of the most motivating stories you'll ever hear, how a teenage girl from Johnson County, Missouri became one of the greatest healing evangelists to ever grace the planet. But there's also a darker side to this story, how a woman called by God and used by Him to perform numerous miracles got caught up in not one, but multiple controversies, scandals, and almost endless accusations. This is also a story of how Kathryn Kuhlman faced outrage, not just from the media or outsiders, but from her very own followers. She was sued by her trusted associates, faced gender bias and discrimination, and raised controversies with her marriage and health. And yet, despite all the scandals that surrounded Kathryn Kuhlman, she remains a significant and influential figure in the world of evangelism and faith healing. So, it's time we delve into the truth. Welcome to the persecutions of Kathryn Kuhlman. Kathryn Kuhlman was only 14 years when she experienced a divine spiritual awakening that led her to commit her life to Christ. And so, at age 16, she decided to leave her home in Concordia, Missouri, where she had been born, and join her sister Myrtle and brother-in-law Everett Parrott, who were both traveling evangelists. Together they traveled extensively, holding tent meetings in various locations, like Washington and Oregon. These evangelical meetings would help Kathryn in developing her public speaking and preaching abilities, as she would go on to hold her very first independent preaching in a small mission church in Boise, Idaho, after a Nazarene pastor invited her to stay and preach. So this would officially be the beginning of Kathryn Kuhlman's ministry, and for the next 17 years, her ministry grew significantly as she kept preaching and holding several revivals. Everything seemed to be going all well until Kathryn made a decision that would see her become the subject of heavy criticisms. In 1937, Kathryn Kuhlman met Burroughs Waltrip, an evangelist from Austin, Texas, during his first visit to the Denver Revival Tabernacle, where she was preaching. Waltrip had come on the recommendation of radio evangelist Phil Kerr and stayed for nearly 2 months. Being a charismatic person and having good looks, Kathryn Kuhlman soon became attracted to him, and shortly after, their relationship grew closer. However, there was a major issue. You see, Waltrip was married at the time, even bringing his wife, Jessie, and their 2 young sons along during his second visit to Denver. And so, his relationship with Kathryn became quite controversial. The controversy would even get worse when Waltrip would end up leaving his wife and children to pursue his relationship with Kathryn. Despite warnings and disapproval from her close friends and associates about the inappropriateness of the relationship, Kathryn and Waltrip would proceed to get married on October 18, 1938 in Mason City, Iowa. This decision had severe consequences for Kathryn's ministry, as many of her supporters and church members, who had looked up to her as a model of purity and holiness, were deeply disappointed by her choice. Helen Gulliford, a very close friend and partner in Kathryn's ministry, was one of the first to express her concerns about the marriage. She claimed to have noticed a change in Kathryn's preaching, observing that her sermons were losing their previous vigor and effectiveness. Helen believed that Kathryn's decision to marry Waltrip would destroy her ministry. Eventually, she resigned from Kathryn Kuhlman's ministry altogether. But that wasn't all, because shortly after Helen Gulliford resigned, several other members would also follow, leaving the ministry in protest. This would sadly lead to a major decline in members of Kathryn's ministry. And to make matters worse, Kathryn struggled to find acceptance in the religious community anymore. Churches that had previously welcomed her began to turn her away. Kathryn soon came to the realization that the marriage was a mistake. Over time, the strain of the relationship and the damage it had caused to her ministry led to their separation. Kathryn would eventually divorce Waltrip. The divorce allowed her to start rebuilding her ministry, praying and trusting God for help in regaining the trust of her followers and restore her reputation. And well, God answered. Because in 1947, something shocking happened that would change the course of Kathryn Kuhlman's ministry forever. On April 27, 1947, Kathryn Kuhlman began a series of sermons focusing on the Holy Spirit at her services. It was during one of these services that a miraculous healing occurred spontaneously as she preached. The healing, which happened without any specific prayer or healing line, puzzled Kathryn Kuhlman, but confirmed her belief in the power of the Holy Spirit to heal. Following this initial healing, Kathryn's services increasingly became known for miraculous healings that continued to occur spontaneously during her sermons. These healings drew more people to her ministry, seeking both physical and spiritual healing. The growth of her healing ministry marked a new phase in Kathryn's life, where she became widely recognized for her role in bringing about several miraculous recoveries. However, just as the popular saying goes, with every new level comes a new devil. This new phase of Kathryn's ministry soon began to anger a lot of people. First, it was the fundamentalist preachers. These preachers opposed the idea of women in ministry. A prominent fundamentalist preacher from Ohio, in the person of Dallas Billington, was particularly vocal in his opposition. He, along with others, believed that divine healing should not be administered by a woman and that it was unscriptural for women to preach. He and other fundamentalist preachers also argued that Kathryn Kuhlman was not qualified to minister because she had not attended seminary, an educational institution for training religious leaders, particularly in Christianity, where students are typically prepared for roles such as pastors, priests, or theologians, more like a Bible school or school of ministry in today's world. Despite these attacks, Kathryn maintained her position and continued her ministry. She responded to these criticisms by emphasizing her role as a handmaiden of God, consistently deflecting the focus from herself to the work of the Holy Spirit. And then, you'd think that since Kathryn's healing ministry wasn't accepted by the fundamentalists' denomination, it would definitely be accepted by the Pentecostals. But that wasn't the case. The Pentecostals didn't approve of Kathryn's ministry either. They criticized her for not publicly discussing her baptism in the Holy Spirit and for not allowing the expression of tongues in her miracle services. They saw these practices as essential signs of spiritual authenticity, and Kathryn's reluctance to embrace them publicly was viewed as a denial of a fundamental aspect of Pentecostal faith. But even after all these, Kathryn maintained a non-denominational approach, focusing on the message of Christ rather than denominational differences. While this decision allowed her to reach a broad spectrum of believers, it also placed her under constant scrutiny from both sides. With time, pastors and church leaders began accusing Kathryn of sheep stealing. They claimed that her services were drawing people away from their congregations, which they saw as a threat to their authority. In response, Kathryn famously quipped that she was not stealing sheep, but feeding a flock of starving lambs, implying that the churches were failing to nourish their congregants spiritually. This remark, while intended to defend her ministry, only intensified the controversy, leading to further tensions with religious leaders. But these religious denominations and leaders weren't the only set of people that despised Kathryn Kuhlman's ministry, because outside the four walls of the Christian community, a new set of enemy had been birthed.